Doctors with disabilities exist in small but measurable numbers. How did they navigate their journey? What were the challenges? What are the benefits to patients and to their peers? What can we learn from their experiences? My name is Lisa Meeks, and I'm thrilled to bring you the Docs with Disabilities podcast. Join me as I interview docs, nurses, psychologists, OTs, PTs, pharmacists, dentists, and the list goes on. I'll also be interviewing the researchers and policymakers that ensure medicine remains an equal opportunity profession. This episode of the podcast shares a recording of an April 2024 Docs with Disabilities panel titled Shaping the Future, a live panel on disability inclusion in Canadian medical education. The panel was recorded live from the International Congress on Academic Medicine, or ICAM, in Vancouver, British Columbia. The focus of the panel was the critical work being done to advance disability inclusion in the medical field in Canada. Our guests' insights and experiences underscored the importance of continued advocacy, education, and policy development to create a more inclusive and equitable healthcare system.
This podcast is coming to you from Vancouver, British Columbia. In the spirit of truth, reconciliation, friendship, and reciprocity, we would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. This place is a testament to the enduring presence and resilience of Indigenous peoples, and we honor their deep connection to these lands and waters.
And now, on to our panel. Good morning. My name is Lisa Meeks, and I am the co-host of the Docs with Disabilities podcast. We are so excited to be here today. We've had the pleasure of doing an actual Canadian series on our podcast. And so we've highlighted stories, including many of the individuals up here, talking about their individual stories, their experiences. And I am so in awe of everything that happens in the Canadian space with regard to research and activism and action. And it is just a privilege to be here with you today and to highlight some of this collectively in this panel. And so we're going to start with introductions. Jerry, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Thanks very much, Lisa. My name is Jerry Maniate. I'm the Executive Director of the Equity and Health Systems Lab. I'm also a general internist at the Ottawa Hospital and the University of Ottawa, and I also have another hat, which is the Vice Chair of Member Support for the Department of Medicine at the University of Ottawa.
Good morning, Lisa. My name's Franco Rizzuti. I'm a public health and preventive medicine physician based out of Calgary, working as a medical officer of health. I'm also an academic at the University of Calgary, teaching across the curriculum at the medical school, and president of the Canadian Association of Physicians with Disabilities. My journey with disability started in my clerkship year. So was off in a motor vehicle collision, back injury, and my journey back to medicine was quite tumultuous, and so CAPD was really a lifeline for me, and I've been involved in this space ever since. Happy to be here, Lisa.
Thanks, everyone. My name's Lynn Ashdown. Pleasure to be here and happy to see so many people here today. So I am MD trained and family medicine trained. I'm not practicing clinically as life-altering injuries took me on a very different trajectory than I had ever planned. I do have a master's in medical education that focuses on patient partnership, and really that's about including those with lived experience in healthcare professional education, and also as someone who now lives with multiple disabilities, I'm involved in research, disability education, and also advocacy for all those living with disabilities, a member of the Equity and Health Systems Lab, and member of the Canadian Association of Physicians with Disabilities. So thank you, happy to be here.
Thank you, Lynn. Good morning, everyone, and good morning, Lisa. My name is Quinten Clarke. I am clinically a PGY3 resident in the Psychiatry Research Track program at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. But similar to Franco and to Lynn, I also am involved with the Canadian Association of Physicians with Disabilities. I'm the vice president of that organization and have held different roles in that organization over the last few years, but my major responsibility has been founding and leading the trainee group within that organization that has medical student and resident members from across the country, about 150 at this point, from a variety of different specialties and different programs. I also identify as an individual with a disability, and similar to Franco, actually, I was actually born with several congenital anomalies, which I've lived with my entire life, and kind of reached a stable point, actually, through most of my life. But then in medical school, I ended up getting diagnosed with Crohn's disease on top of that. So kind of brought me back into the patient sphere a bit, and reignited my passion for this work.
You are definitely passionate about this work. I really am I mean it truly. I'm so lucky to know all of you and to be able to share this space with you today. Jerry, I'm going to start with you because I think that this is one of the most important questions, and that if we don't address disability through this, we're missing the entire foundation. So why is it critical to include disability as part of the DEI framework?
That's an excellent question, Lisa, and you're right. It's foundational to the reason why this podcast is here, the work that each of these individuals are doing on an ongoing basis, because the existing work that has been done on this side of the border, we call it EDI, but DEI on south of the border. It has been an interesting space over the last number of years. There's been a lot of work being done, but that one piece has been really missing in the conversation, which is about accessibility. And so we've really tried to encourage and partner and collaborate and stand beside groups such as the CAPD to try and find ways to really integrate that into the conversation. Yes, equity, yes, diversity, inclusion, but inclusion for all. And if we're talking about inclusion for all, we need to talk about accessibility challenges, right? And we can look at it in two ways. One would be those that we're serving. Patients come into the hospital not because they're well. They're not coming to a hotel. They're coming because there's something impeding their health and their well-being, and it will inevitably impact their access and accessibility. But we also can look at it from the learners, and each of my colleagues have spoken about their own personal experience as learners who have had to wrestle with the challenges that they're facing, but also looking at the opportunities that they have to make a difference. And so by bringing accessibility into the conversation, I think opens up and helps us also explore intersectional spaces as well. So it's not as simple as people would like to think. People are complicated. People are unique. And that's what makes these conversations tough, but we can find ways to bring language to those conversations.
Excellent, excellent points. So, Lynn, I'm going to go to you. You trained, as you noted, to be a physician, but your training was during a time that you were not disabled. This gives you such an interesting perspective, and one that many people do not have. And then you have on the flip side this significant experience as a patient with a disability, right? So you're seeing medicine, as Jerry outlined, from both of those roles. So tell us, how do you use this experience and this knowledge to inform your work?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. And, I will be the first to admit that upon becoming disabled, my eyes were opened, and for the first time, I really saw how entrenched ableism is within not only society, but within healthcare, within medical education. And I will call myself out. I give myself a failing grade in terms of what I knew or what I didn't know when it comes to disability. My only knowledge was around the medical model of disability, and also, you know, if I asked myself, would I have been prepared to give equal quality of care to patients with disabilities? My answer would have been no. And we know that the research supports that. And I own that. So ever since then, I've been on a mission to really try to change the system, and in a way, I'm grateful for that unique view. Now, how I use this is sort of, I take a sort of layered approach. One is changing disability curriculum within medical institutions. It needs to be anti-ableist and anti-oppressive, and taught primarily by those with disabilities. We need to listen to those with disabilities, and that's where I know, Lisa Meeks, you had co-authored a paper about disability conscious medical education, and that really is about learning from those with disabilities. And so in trying to do sort of the disability lecture reform within my local university, I made a very, very strong effort and to bring in probably about 90% of the teachers for that component were all those with lived experience with disabilities. And so that's kind of one area. Another area is we need to support learners and physicians with disabilities. They need to have the same resources and the opportunities to thrive just as much as their non-disabled peers. And so that's sort of another area that you know, I'm using sort of I call it my pre-life and my new life to sort of advocate for change. But then the other thing as well is we actually have to educate current faculty, other healthcare providers, all stakeholders involved as well, because it doesn't just start in medical school. It perpetuates, ableism perpetuates across the spectrum. So it actually also is about outreach to everybody beyond education itself.
Great points. And I think you're so uniquely situated to do the work that you're doing now, and your ability to speak to both of those spaces that you've been in, and your honesty. Really, thank you for your honesty. You know, yesterday we had Cheryl Holmes up here who said, and as a leader said, I didn't know what technical standards were, and I found myself really questioning these. That honesty really gives other people the ability to lean into, okay, it's okay to not know. It's okay to not know that I'm ableist, but now that I know, what am I going to do about it? So I think you not only are well situated to inform this because of your dual experiences, but you're also really, you make it approachable. You make the work and the knowledge and learning really approachable. And informing the work with people with disabilities, as you know, is so important. So thank you for everything you're doing.
Thanks for saying that. I appreciate it. Yeah. I try to bring an honest approach to everything that I do, and hopefully that has sort of a trickle-down effect.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm going to move to Quinten and Franco, and I'm going to ask you if you just feel free to play off of one another. I obviously am very familiar with the medical education disability research in the United States, and I just watch with admiration from afar when I look at everything that's happening here in Canada. I'm wondering if you can take me on a little bit of a history lesson, and start with kind of when this catalyzed. It seems to me, as an outsider at least, that in the last 5 years there has been an explosion of work in this area. It has really just grown and become, in many cases, I would argue that the Canadians are leading the work. And so can you tell me a little bit about what's happening in that education space?
Sure. So maybe I'll start and then I'll pass it over to Quinten. So you're right, Lisa. The space has really blossomed in the last decade. And so I'll take us back maybe a little bit before. And so if we look back into the late 70s, early 80s within the Canadian medical education space, early versions of the current technical standards before this revision were put in place. These technical standards were, quite prescriptive as to what was required to be a physician. And for probably the better part of 20 years, a lot of the work in medical education, in medical policy, in the health profession space around disability was always transactional, deficits-based, and around accommodations. It was, what happens if someone has an accommodation? And it was to that bare minimum space of someone has some sort of need, and the default typically was, let's actually see how do we bridge someone to retirement, bridge them to doing something else. And so the narrative for many years, especially in the trainee space, was get disability insurance.
Can I ask you to go, just because what you're saying is brilliant, just go a little bit deeper. Our audience may not be familiar with the term transactional nor accommodation. And so can you explain that a little bit more for our audience? Because what you're saying right now, Franco, is, to me, it is so important.
Yeah, of course. So if we look at individuals, we'll start at medical school, right? The advice was get disability insurance. And the thinking was, should something happen to you, motor vehicle collision, skiing accident, diagnosed with a life-altering diagnosis or condition, go take time off. That was a transactional piece. You have something, we're going to interact with you at that point of time, tell you to leave training, leave practice as a physician, go get better, and if you can return back now able-bodied, we'll do a return to work and you're able to come. If you can't, well, that's what disability insurance is for. That's what a strategy to find something else non-clinical to do. It was all in that sense of deficit, right? You are not able to do what is defined as the work of a physician, the work of a medical learner. And so that was the space for 20 years. And it was really a variety of folks who are in this room, some case law cases, a lot of advocacy and tenacity to say, I'm a physician living with a disability, living with a different set of abilities, and I can still practice. What I can do might not be what a general surgeon can do, but we don't need everyone to be a general surgeon in Canada. We need folks to practice across the continuum. And so we started to see kind of case law one-offs. It was an accommodation. Okay, what are we going to do to accommodate you? What are we going to do to allow you to finish training? What are we going to do to allow you to work in this one spot? And so that was the space, really until the mid-2010s. Some scholarship work around disability. I will say the pandemic then really galvanized and catalyzed, right? A lot of the things that we said we couldn't do. We can't do virtual care. Everybody did virtual care. Oh, you can't treat a patient if you can't touch them. We did that. And so a lot of the things that we can't do, we were then able to do. And so that was a bit of the groundswell. And then we started talking now about ability, acknowledging, as Lynn said, the ableism in medicine. And only recently do we actually have data. And so that's one of the other challenges, is we lived in a dearth of data. We didn't know how many physicians had an accommodation. And I'll give one final example before I hand it over to Quinten. So as I was a medical student, and that wasn't that long ago, just over a decade ago, we were fighting, I was class president, we were fighting to allow left-handed students to write exams in the lecture hall on the left-handed desks. That was an accommodation. They needed to go get an accommodation to sit in a desk that supported them as a human. Now we don't have that. Now we recognize that learners can sit in whatever desk they so choose to sit in. But that was the environment we were in a decade ago. And so terrific work, a lot of changes. And I think with that, I'll hand it over to Quinten.
Thanks, Franco. I think, and I suppose I should clarify in terms of Franco and I, his career is a bit longer than mine at this point. But in terms of my approach to this work and my relatively earlier, more recent involvement in it, rather, I really saw, similar to Franco around the COVID pandemic, many things shifting in terms of what we thought was possible and really creating new possibilities. Particularly, though, I think in terms of EDI inclusion, particularly what Jerry was talking about earlier as well, I think it should not go unnoted that the events in the US have really impacted us as well in Canada. Not only in terms of the work that's coming out of your work at Michigan and then the group at Stanford as well, but also in terms of social events such as the murder of George Floyd and the response to that from Black academics and activists, as well as our own Indigenous scholars here in Canada in terms of their work over the last decade and much longer than that. Which really brought a new appetite to medicine to reflect on many of these EDI, EDIA initiatives and really opened a lot of doors and new forums that folks like ourselves from the disability community were invited to be a part of. Which then, that we were invited to be a part of. In terms of the advocacy work that's been ongoing, a lot of it, at least in our space, has been led by learners, particularly medical students and residents from across Canada who have been advocating, in some cases, for their own accommodation needs, but through that, recognizing when discrepancies have appeared in terms of one disability that essentially being identical to a student who has a disability at another institution being accommodated at one school but not at the other, which led to this new discordance and the new kind of questions it raised of, well, why can't that other institution accommodate this student who can become a physician, say on the West Coast, but not somewhere back east? And so that work has started growing, and it's started to develop kind of tendrils into different spaces, a little bit of academic work, a bit of research that's come out of that, some opinion pieces, some more public-facing work, and actually some great work that Lynn and Jerry did together in terms of the EQHS position statement on disability. But those invitations also opened us up into spaces at a national level, such as what Dr. Victor Doe was speaking about just earlier at this conference on the Okanagan Charter Collaborative and the way that that has been implemented or is in the process of being implemented in the academic medicine space. And so Franco and I are involved in that work as well. But being invited to that space where we have that access to senior medical leadership who have a great deal of capacity to establish changes within their own faculties and to communicate with the other faculties has really been kind of instrumental in driving that change.
It's so interesting that I think it's really important when you're doing work. People come into the work at various times in their career and their education. And when they come in, they only see what's in front of them, right? So I'll have learners come in and say, we have so much work to do. We have so much work to do. And I'm sitting there thinking, look how far we've come, right? And so I think it's so important when I'm talking to people about the work, especially work across a country or within an organization, to think about it as a historical timeline. What were the conditions and what are they now? And that's really, really important. You brought up two things that I want to expand on. One was much of the work is being done by the learners. I mean, these learners are amazing. The learners we have coming into our institutions now are very social justice oriented. Lynn, you talked about the paper. I almost shy away from you saying it's a paper that I did on disability consciousness, because it was led by a learner, Lydia Smeltz, and she came to me and said, "This is what I want to write about. Can we do this?" Absolutely. But the learners are coming up with ideas that I don't think I would have had a decade ago and still may not have, right? So this collaboration and this willingness to lean into working with learners and having them lead research and lead agendas, I think is so important. I'm going to ask all of you to think about your current work. I know that you're all involved in ongoing work, and our audience may not be aware of that work as it happens, right? There's so much data that we could talk about in the US, but it's not published yet because we're waiting on the journal timelines. That seems to be the case everywhere. So tell me about what you're working on now. What are you passionate about? What are the deliverables? What should we expect to see? Yeah.
So maybe I'll start with that one, Lisa. I see myself in sort of two spaces, but heavily influenced by these individuals that are up at the front, and many others that I've been very fortunate to meet and to learn from in this space, because I find myself on that learning journey myself, as a leader, as someone who's trying to do work in this space. And so one of the things that I've been very fortunate to be involved with is the work in terms of physical space. We're in Ottawa building a brand new campus, and there are some very practical questions that happen, right? Such as, how much space? Should that all be shared space? But what implications does that have? And having a colleague, Michael Kwan, who I'm very fortunate to work alongside in my own division, and the insights that he has completely flips the conversation. Because all of a sudden, we're having conversations with the space planners and the architects about, what about neurodivergent individuals? What about those in which sound and visual distractions are problematic for doing work? Notwithstanding all the patient privacy and confidentiality kind of concerns, but these are concerns that most of them haven't even thought of. So finding colleagues who are interested and passionate about this, who can bring their insights because of their expertise and lived experience into that space, and being someone who can learn from that has been very helpful for me. The second piece has been the education, and I've been learning a lot from people like Lynn and Julia Hines, who was on the podcast earlier, to learn from them and the work that they're doing with groups on helping us articulate for people what is ableism, what is disability justice, what is accessibility challenges. How do we help educate at least the foundational level, and then move that so that people are at least talking the same language? Because some of the terms that we talked about this morning, you paused us so that we could define them. And most people wouldn't understand that, especially if they haven't had those experiences. And so I find myself in a humbling position of, how do I steward, how do I create space for these conversations to happen and connect people so that they can inform the bigger conversations, whether it's policy, space, or even education.
Yeah. I love how you're not only getting information from individuals that have physical disabilities or sensory disabilities, but you're thinking about the full spectrum of disability and just about what's comfortable for everybody. Anything that we adjust for a person with a disability is going to result in a better learning environment for everyone, right? But I love that you are acknowledging the need to lean into some of those other categories. The neurodivergent category is by far the largest category of learner we have in the US, and I believe as well in Canada. So it's important. And unfortunately, many people think about what is the kind of the bottom line for legal requirements when it comes to physical space. And they're thinking only about learners that have physical disabilities or sensory disabilities. And in keeping with the Canada theme here of doing great work north of the border, then this is wonderful that you're thinking about this in such a cohesive, full way. Frank? Or Lynn? Yeah.
Thanks. I just wanted to add to what Jerry was mentioning about, so we do have a new hospital that's being built within the next few years in Ottawa, and I'm sitting on the accessibility committee for that, and a huge focus was on how do we make the environment accessible for the patients, which is absolutely fantastic, but universal design is such that it's how do we make it accessible for everybody. And so one of the things that I'm really kind of trying to hammer home when I sit on that committee is, well, how is it accessible for every physician, for every nurse, for every speech language pathologist, every housekeeping, employee, everything. So it's not, while we do healthcare for patients, everyone benefits when we focus on inclusive design and I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought, but that's the brain injury, so I can play that card. But yeah, so just it's also about making sure that that we support. If we want a workforce to better resemble that of society, then we need to create the environment that supports the people that we want in the workforce as well. So I just wanted to add to that part.
Thanks, Lynn. I can speak a little bit to some of the work CAPD is doing. Really, we're in a state and a phase now of growth and capacity building. So for those who don't know, the Canadian Association of Physicians with Disabilities, entirely volunteer-based organization. We have no staff. It is all physicians or physician trainees living with a disability, working to support our colleagues. We fundamentally believe in not taxing our members. So it's an organization anyone can apply to join if you're a physician or, like I said, physician trainee with a disability or an ally. And so we're really working now. We have about 400 members across the country, all stages of training, a variety of disabilities. And so we're working on capacity building. Just having supports for each other, as Quinten was saying, to be able to collate a list of what have been the accommodations, what are some of the processes in place, raising awareness, and also right now really working on policy statements. So folks have talked about universal design, about access in buildings. We have a patchwork in Canada of legislation, some provinces a little bit more ahead than others. But what cuts across, and I think is an opportunity that we're trying to capitalize on, is standards. We have CSA standards for health centers. They guide our buildings. They guide what we do in new builds. They guide renovations. There's terrific language in there around accessibility. So we're leveraging that. We're talking with Accreditation Canada to have health authority and hospital accreditation reflect the need for universal design. We're looking at medical school accreditation standards at the UG and PG levels to talk about how can we make sure that accommodation policies are captured, but not just that it's a checkbox to have it, but that it's actually the spirit and the operationalization is supporting the mandate. So we're working on policy levers. We're working in data. Just in the most recent Canadian Medical Association Physician Health Survey, we now have data around self-disclosed physicians who identify as living with a disability. This is the first time we've had this data in Canada. That's powerful. So we're really working now on capacity building, supporting academics, supporting leaders, and supporting folks living with disabilities.
Thanks, Franco. And I can speak a bit to some of the work that the trainee group particularly is doing. In terms of the Okanagan Charter work that Franco and I have been involved with, I think that really has offered a forum to raise some of these potential solution to really long-standing issues facing trainees and staff physicians as well with disabilities. And so that has been part of that work. But separate from that, in terms of the more in-house work that we've been doing, two of my dear colleagues, Dr. Shira Gertzman and Dr. Jordana Wasserman, have developed a very excellent mentorship program, peer mentorship program, that drew in members from across Canada. Currently, it's just medical students and residents, but there is early talks of expanding it to staff physicians. But drew in members from across Canada to really do that peer support piece, to help people with career questions, to help people navigate how to get accommodations, what accommodations they should be thinking about at various stages of training. And so their work in that space has been really excellent, and I can't overstate that. And I should say their feedback they've received from the first iteration and now the beginning of the second iteration of that program has been quite positive as well. Separately, there is an excellent disability curriculum project that I'll speak to that we began developing, and I should say Dr. Lynn Ashdown and Dr. Julia Haynes, as well as Dr. Kristen Hall, were very involved with the leadership of that project. But it is a series of modules that were developed with the aid of a Canadian Federation of Medical Students grant, that was developed, or co-developed rather, with trainees with disabilities as well as patient partners to provide a brief curriculum to help educate UGME and PGME learners on what is disability, what does disability look like, how can we deliver better care to individuals in our practices with disability. And so that project was initially developed at CAPD and since has been actually handed over to Jerry's group at the Equity and Health Services Lab. They're taking it to the next stage with CME accreditation, or CME credit and whatnot. But my little breadcrumbs is stay tuned for that becoming public facing in the very near future, because I think it will be a very useful resource to provide that kind of continuing professional development piece, both for the learners but also potentially for the faculty.
I just wanted to add one more thing. So we're talking about, we know ableism doesn't happen in silos. It's not just a healthcare problem. It's not just a medical education problem. It's a societal problem. One of the things that, you know, I'm really proud of is taking on an ableist society and actually advocating for legislative changes, because we've all said it, that legislation is poor at weak, and it really talks about the bare minimum. It really still leaves those with disabilities quite oppressed. A personal anecdote, probably, I guess it's coming up on 2 years now. We had a pretty big storm back in Ottawa, and I was actually left trapped in my apartment for 10 days because the apartment that I lived in didn't have a backup generator for an elevator. So I actually literally couldn't get out. And now, obviously, I'm okay, and I had wonderful, I had wonderful friends, and even my medical team that really reached out to me, made sure that I had food and whatnot. But that really, I think that was the catalyst for me to try to take on things at a legislative level. That sort of transpired to introducing a private member's bill at Ontario legislature. Crashed and burned, but anyway, I still tried. And you know what? The number of people that then heard of the story, that knew that wasn't, people said to me, how is this not already a thing? Like, how is this allowed to happen? So even though this time around, the policy, the bill didn't pass, more people know about it. And then, and so dealing with everything within a healthcare perspective and medical education perspective, but then also opening up the world to the challenges of disability and ableism as well.
You know, Lynn, I'm going to maybe take a leap here, but I think about your experience and how what a lack of control or a lack of autonomy you feel in that situation to do anything, right? And I think about that as a patient, but I also think about that same framing and that same experience for our learners coming into a system that's highly ableist, where, as Franco was saying earlier, there is a chance that you will be shown the door if you express any needs, right? That it'll be a, well, that's fine, and we invite you to leave, and then come back when you are completely healed or you have what all of the capabilities back, right? And how frightened the learners must be, and they have such a lack of power in so many cases. And so one of the things that I'm thinking really needs to be a theme throughout all of the work, and I'm sure this is happening with all of you, is a sense of safety for not only the patients, but for the learners. How do your initiatives build a sense of safety for people coming through them? And how would we build as a society, how would we build more safety and more understanding in this for anyone?
Do you want I can start. I think one of the ways that you build safety is to recognize that we're all flawed humans and we're all going to make mistakes. And if you can show grace and compassion, even when harm has occurred, but once you know, I like to take the sort of approach that, we all have bias. That's just a fact. And I really want to take there's a stigma attached to that word, and I really want to take that out because we all have bias. Once we come to terms with that and we learn where our biases exist, if all of a sudden you didn't know what ableism was and now you do know for the first time, the harm that occurred may not have been intentional, but once you know, then it's on you to actually make the change. You really hit the nail on the head when you spoke about how fearful and scary that was, for me being stuck in the dark for 10 days in a wheelchair with a brain injury. But, again, how fearful for learners and physicians who have trained their whole lives to achieve this. And I think one of the things we talk a lot about psychological safety, and maybe Jerry can talk a little bit more about how you can create a safe space, because that's something that I've learned a lot from him, is that how he creates a safe space for open dialogue.
Thanks, Lynn. And I think part of this is even just the realization, and I'm going to be speaking to a group of surgical residents tomorrow, which is going to be always interesting for me, not being a surgeon. But I remind them that it's a matter of when, not if, something like this could happen to us or to someone in our immediate circles. And we'll have to wrestle with this. And it's amazing the sense of invulnerability, right, that most will either portray or convey in our profession, because I think we sort of voice that on them. We kind of say you have to have that persona to survive and thrive and be successful. But the reality is vulnerability is actually like a superpower to unlocking conversations. When you share your own personal experience and you come at it with this approach of humility and curiosity, you're unlocking those opportunities where you're going to just sit back and listen and reflect, learn, unlearn, relearn in that space. And we don't do that enough as leaders, as faculty, as learners. That's just not taught. And so as a result, we don't create space for the kind of conversations that really do matter, and to create opportunities to explore how can we make things better, and how can we understand what the needs of our learners, our peer colleagues, those that are working around us, to make the entire space better. And I've heard over the last few comments even the reference to the Okanagan Charter. The concept of the health promoting work and learning environment is a powerful tool for us to unlock these conversations with our senior leaders who may or may not fully understand what those terms actually mean. We can define it. We can own it, we can define it, we can share, we can say, we'd love to be part of the conversation to help you get there. And I think that's what these kind of conversations can provide, is that safety to have those kind of conversations and the vulnerability. And I think the other piece is to tag into things that a lot of senior leaders do know about, things like improving healthcare. Most would probably rattle off the triple or quadruple aim, but do they know about the quintuple aim or the sextuple aim, right? The quintuple includes now advancing health equity. That's a huge door to unlock for a leader. And now with environmental sustainability as part of the sextuple aim, there's other facets that we can have difficult conversations that we never thought had an entry point into these tables, and we can come there as vulnerable individuals who want to learn, who want to be part of the process and share in that space.
I'll add perhaps 3 examples of I think ways that we're trying to enhance safety. One is language, and Jerry and Lynn both alluded to it, but it's shifting towards a strength-based set of languages and really shifting away from the medical model of disability towards the social model of disability. And whether that's in policy, in discourse, really moving to a place where we recognize the unique abilities folks bring. That's the first. The second place that I think we're making strides and we're trying to enhance safety is, again, the same principles a lot of us would take in the clinical space of trauma-informed care, but not re-traumatizing an individual. What does that mean? Well, every time a learner or an individual with a disability with a chronic condition has to re-disclose, and often this is on a new rotation, on a new unit. You're applying for an elective, you're applying for a job, you're going to a new site. How do we remove that barrier? How do we have information that cuts across and is appropriately shared? So using a lot of the great research data principles we have, the scholarly work that's already done, how do we translate that into the equity space, into the disability and accommodation space? So doing work, you know, if ideally if we take this out, what we'd love to have is a safe process where you go through an accommodation process once and it follows you. So if you're doing an elective, you don't have to go through another set of psychoed assessments as an example. And the final piece that we're doing and enhancing safety is recognizing that when a learner, especially, is coming to a leader, coming to an educator with an accommodation, the hat that that leader's wearing at that time is as a leader, as a policymaker, not as a care provider. And so really recognizing that the auto-doctoring a lot of us will do with our patients should not be happening when we're talking about an accommodation. And so it's not up to us to reassess, oh, do they fit my image of what that disability is, but rather to trust the patient, trust the physician, the learner to say, yeah, these are their needs and how do I remove barriers? So these are some of the tactical things we're trying to do to enhance safety.
Thank you all for answering that. I know that wasn't planned, but I think Lynn brought up such a really good point. And I think the need to speak to, as we're moving things forward, as we're improving policy, as we're improving practice, that we also think about improving and increasing the safety of the learner, because until then, there's a distrust there that goes back to the ableist experiences that we all have. Quinten, I'm going to turn to you. Your organization, CAPD, that you and Franco and Lynn, that so many people in this room are involved in as well. What is the role of an organization like that? Where do you fit in to moving this agenda forward, and how is it important? What important role is it playing in this movement?
So I like to think we fit in as being an organization. I know that's kind of answering the question with kind of restating the phrase, classic psychiatry trick, right?
I was sitting next to a psychiatrist. I didn't think that through.
But I feel like often at these forums, organizations tend to get invited, not so much people. CAPD gets invited to present at a conference or to weigh in on a policy statement or whatnot. And the value of CAPD as an organization is really in the diversity within it. Franco and I and Lynn have kind of our own individual experiences of disability, but our organization as a whole is a big tent organization for folks with disabilities. We have folks with conditions varying from mental health conditions to sensory impairments all the way to more chronic conditions and everything in between. And so the kind of humility that comes along with that is when those of us who may be the first ones to receive the email or text or whatever don't know the answer to a question, we know who to go to get the answer, or who to tap to say, do you feel like you could present at this conference or weigh in on this policy statement? I think the other thing as well, and it relates a little bit back to what we were talking about safety, is as a trainee especially who can be somewhat vulnerable in these spaces, being a part of an organization and representing an organization provides a degree of cover that if you misspeak or if perhaps there is an opinion that is not popular in a given room, that organization often will share or support you through that or in that scenario. I think it takes away a bit of the concern of professionalism being weaponized against you for speaking truth to power, which I think, I mean, even in recent examples, we've had some examples in Canadian medical education around that. But I feel like that's kind of part of the big aspect that CAPD has been able to help in these spaces.
That's lovely, a great explanation. It also sounds like you're building community, which can just be psychologically so helpful to know you're not in it alone. What other aspects of that community building are beneficial and just helping people on their path and their training?
Yeah, thanks. I think there's a variety of pieces. So one, it's allowing a space to just have discussion amongst folks, right? A safe space in a lot of ways, or at least a brave space to share their experience. Often we do a little bit of workshopping, right? Someone says, I am now in this situation struggling with access or seeking an accommodation. Well, let's not reinvent the wheel. So there's the ability to share lessons learned, share what's worked, bounce ideas off of each other. So there's definitely a workshopping ability to support an individual with a request. And, you know, you had alluded a little bit to this earlier, Lisa, of the thoughts and the ideas that come from folks. It's also really powerful to bring folks together, to have that discussion, to say, hey, I'm thinking about this. What might you know about it? So that's very powerful. And overall, I think just it enhances the capacity. I'm really excited about where we're at. You know, when we look back in history, yeah, it was a tough time, but I think we're in a much better spot now. There's an understanding. We're talking about ableism. And so I think it's also creating a space to just enhance knowledge, approach things with curiosity.
I just wanted to add a comment, because the fact that all of you have referenced the idea of community is so critical in this difficult work, especially when you are saying things that may be unpopular to a leader. You have to make an accommodation. We have to rethink this policy. That's the last thing most of them want to actually do, because that's a lot of paperwork and a lot of time, and it's not their cognitive space, right? This is not their area of expertise. And so by having that community and saying, well, actually, this is what we say, the we sort of standing there together as allies, as partners in that kind of space, really empowers the individual to be able to speak up, especially when it's not just, you know, a couple of people in a specific unit or division. It's much broader. It allows for some power to be sort of pushed into that voice.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with all of what you've said. Jerry, I'm gonna push you a little bit further because you are a leader in this EDI space. What should our EDI leaders be doing to support initiatives like CAPD or support the inclusion of individuals with disabilities and training and practice? What's the role of EDI leaders?
So first of all is to even reframe it to include that accessibility. So even by starting there, and if we're saying inclusion for all, it really means for all. If we're saying anti-oppression, it's for all, and we need to go and dissect that out. We need to go and interrogate, well, when we say this, what are we saying? And pushing out, because I think there have been historical events that have focused, galvanized specific groups in very specific spaces. But accessibility, disability, ableism, these things have not really been given the space to really talk about it. Lynn's example of being trapped in an apartment for 10 days, for me, was the first thing I ever saw in media that highlighted something of this nature. Yes, we hear specific examples, but of individuals not having difficulty accessing care or having poor care in the system. But here's someone, because of who she is, was literally trapped, right? And we can't figure this out. That's a space for us as leaders, as not just in the equity, diversity, inclusivity, and accessibility space, but I see myself as someone who can potentially influence the conversation at that health system level, right? And that's where some of these conversations happen. Like, health is not just the hospital and the primary care and that. Health systems, if you look at the WHO definition, is so much broader. It includes all those areas and spaces that have indirect impact on the health of individuals. And so if we take that kind of language, then I need to go and open up doors in different other spaces and say, you need to meet the CAPD, right? Door opening, sponsoring opportunities to bring people who may not have those otherwise connections, but I have as leader to bring into that space and say, we're here to help in whatever way you need. As CAPD, how can we as leaders help you, right? And give voice and give strength. Because you're doing this right now, as you were saying, Franco, completely volunteer-based. People who are already have a lot of things on their plates besides the professional and personal. It's trying to make a space for this. We can do better.
Thank you so much. I wanted, you have just teed something up so perfectly for me. Thank you. Sorry. And, you know, Franco talked about the tax earlier, and you didn't expand on it. I think we have a language that we speak, right? And people in EDI spaces speak. It is tax day in the United States, so there is that. But what we're talking about is the extra burden and the work that you must do as an underrepresented, marginalized, minoritized person in a space that wasn't built for you and that is not always welcoming of you. And you know, I want to turn to you, Lynn, because you talked earlier about advocating for legislation. And as you were talking, I was thinking, that's amazing. You're doing all of this education and doing this, and then you spend 10 days in your building without the ability to even go forward. And I can't imagine how many phone calls, I don't even know if you had internet access, right? Like, how much work was layered upon you in that situation, and then how much work, whether you took it on yourself or what have you, is now layered on you to advocate so that others don't have that, which our learners do, which I know you are doing as part of CAPD. There is a burden in this advocacy, and the advocacy, like with so many other groups or populations that are identified as being oppressed, that is difficult to navigate. And so much of it is with the schools or the organization saying, oh, there's an issue? Okay, great. Tell us what the solution is, right? Giving it back to them, saying, let us know what you would like for us to do, right? So now all of the creativity, all of the removal of barriers then falls on the learner or the physician with a disability. So with that in mind, what is the role of advocacy for people with disabilities, and how can we reduce that burden and reduce that tax for the disabled individual?
Great question. And so you're right. The amount of advocacy that learners and physicians with disabilities need to take on, it's not sustainable. Like it just is not sustainable. You know, being a physician or a medical learner at the best of times is hard. And I mean, we're seeing burnout in levels that we've never seen that before. So then add in all these extra layers. The problem is that, you know, these are the voices that can actually influence change as well. And so with it being not sustainable, we don't want to lose them. And, you know, this might be a little bit of an unpopular statement that I might say right now. I'll preface it with that, but I'll back it up as well, is that any institution that is doing EDI work, that has an office of EDI, if you're not including disability, you're not doing it right. And I'm a very intellectually curious person. And recently I actually looked at every Canadian university's medical schools, just informally, it's not like a research study or anything like that, but looked at their mission statements and what they spoke about, and little to none of them spoke about disability. And if you aren't speaking about that, you are not doing it. And that might be a bit of a, you know, or at least you're not doing it to the full capacity that you should be doing it at. And so for any leaders, any influencers here that has, well, we all have, you know, offices of, you know, equity, diversity, and inclusion. I would implore you to go back and read your mission statement. And if there was a way that my wheelchair could make it up to the, you know, the rooftop somehow, I would scream it from the rooftop that disability is diversity, and it is absolutely part of inclusion. And so to exclude that is actually antithetical to the whole purpose of all of these offices.
It's hard to follow up that. That's like sort of the mic drop moment, right? You know, that's the challenge. That's actually the challenge, right? Is to have each of those offices, the people who call themselves leaders in these spaces, are leaders at the deanery offices, and I see some in this room here, that we need to go back and ask those questions. Those are difficult conversational questions, right? If we're serious about this, it cannot be performative. It cannot be tokenist. It can't just put a poster up and say we're doing it, but practically nothing changes.
And we can't put all of the burden on the
That's
people.
right. So that's the second piece. Cannot put the burden on. And part of the challenge is we're putting the burden on the individuals who are in the midst of this journey personally, and then our entire system doesn't even value. We have no mechanism to provide, quote, credit in our faculty systems to account for this amazing educational advocacy kind of work, because it's not, it's more hidden. It's more in the back seats, right? It's out of view compared to what we would typically valorize and hold up in high regard in our academic spaces. So that's a second sort of aspect. So yes, that burden is there, but I think the burden would be lightened considerably if there was even recognition of some sort. But we don't even do that. So how do we make these connections? As leaders in this space, we have to figure this out, but also to determine what really matters to the individuals who are doing this work. What would recognition, what would support actually be meaningful for the work that you're trying to do.
Well, I have one last question, and then we're going to go to a speed round of kind of the lightning couple of questions that we have at the end. All right, so Quinten, this last question is for you. You have talked about the unwieldy process of getting accommodations, and Franco, you alluded to this idea of a one and done and having your accommodations follow you through. The process of having to disclose your disability multiple times, not only is it a burden, it can be pretty traumatic to have to go through that. The anticipation of what will my preceptor ask me as a result of me disclosing? What will they think of me? Will I be assessed properly? There are so many things that take up a lot of cognitive space every time you're going to disclose your disability. If I gave you a magic wand and I said, fix it, Quinten, how would you approach the process? How do you improve that process?
So I think, and Franco touched on this earlier, but I think you allude to kind of the exact problem of the portability of these accommodations and the need for us to have accommodations processes that are streamlined and centralized. We know that most of the undergraduate medical learners at any institution probably also did their undergraduate degree at that institution. They may or may not have had accommodations during that undergraduate degree, but then they enter undergraduate medical education. The first year to 2 years, depending on your program, largely resemble the same kind of lecture halls, tutorial rooms that you would have been in, the same types of examinations that you would have had as an undergrad. But yet they're reapplying often to the same Center for Accessibility for these accommodations to be reapproved. They then go on, they go to clerkship, they get to the end of their medical school journey, and within 1 year they're applying to CARMS for accommodations as part of the residency match potentially. They're probably writing their Medical College of Canada qualifying exam part 1, which they'll have to apply to the Medical Council of Canada for accommodations. And then a few short months later, they're going to apply again to their residency program for accommodations. So within about 5 years, you're applying for accommodations 5 times, which if you have a stable, long-standing disability that perhaps is not changing, is kind of pointless. It's a waste of the student's time and the student's effort. They're going to have to go back to their physician, family physician, or specialist multiple times to get documentation for this. The institution itself is going to have to process these accommodations multiple times. And it's just a heck of a lot of bureaucracy that really doesn't have anything of added value to the learner or to the institution. And really adds a degree of bureaucracy that has nothing to do with actually learning how to practice medicine. So I think standardizing that and having that portable in a way that these accommodations can follow someone through training, it would be potentially very valuable. And further to that, and I think it alludes to a bit of the work that you're doing, Lisa, actually, in the States, is if we have kind of a centralized body that deals with accommodations, whether it's at the medical school level or at some national level, we can really build the capacity in the experts in that space to do the work properly. By having disability resource professionals and having the knowledge in that space so that we don't have the kind of human resources problem that some institutions have when individuals with that expertise leave and move to other jobs in other sectors. That would be my magic wand solution.
I love it. We are definitely looking to build a center, like a national center, almost like a resource center that you would call into where there is expertise. We have a simulation lab. We can test things out. We have experts in clinical education, all of that. I buy my lottery tickets weekly, and it has not happened yet, but I'm hiring. I keep saying to my team, you have a job and a raise. You have a job and a raise as soon as I win that lottery. So we're hopeful. All right, lightning round. Let's say 5 years from now, what would be a good measure of success? And also, how is this audience going to help you meet that metric? So what is your measure of success? And what are people out there, clinicians, faculty, leaders, EDI folks, disability resource professionals, patients, what's happening in this space that catalyzes and allows for these successes to occur? And we'll go backwards this time, starting with Quinten.
Thanks, Lisa. So I don't know if it's a metric, but something that I think, 10 years down the road that we could look back on and think positively of, I'd really love, I think a lot of what we've talked about has been very kind of sporadic work. We've been putting out fires as we've been going along with issues that have come up or opportunities that have arisen through things like the Okanagan Charter and other initiatives. But I think what I'd like to see in 10 years' time would be that we'd established an overarching vision for addressing disability inclusion and ableism in medical education, and that we're working on this in a more systemic way, where we're able to implement interventions or changes in policies, changes in practices that would make improvements for learners, staff, physicians along that continuum in a more direct and sustained way, rather than this kind of hodgepodge of interventions that we're doing right now.
How can the audience be helpful in meeting this vision?
So I think, recognizing who's in the audience today, I think having national leadership on this is going to be imperative. The AFMC is really well situated to do that work because it is made up of all the various medical schools and has great connections with the other organizations and stakeholders that would need to be involved, like the MCC, like CARMS, like the Royal College. But I think, prioritizing this work and encouraging the deanery to really come to the table for that work and collaborate in that way, because it's for your benefit as physicians, as medical education professionals, in terms of reducing the duplication of work that could happen otherwise.
Yeah, it's also a benefit as patients, current and or future, to improve the physician workforce. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Lynn?
So what I'd love to see next time we're all sitting here reflecting back is an environment where medical learners and physicians with disabilities feel like they belong, that they don't feel othered, and that they're set up not just to survive but to thrive. And so that would be a big dream of mine. And then in terms of how you go about achieving that, we can think big, but it's okay to think small, and it's okay to think local as well. And so what I would love for anyone here and anyone listening to the podcast afterwards is to be curious. If you don't know someone with a disability, befriend someone with a disability. Ask them if it's okay if you ask some questions. And, anybody in healthcare, I want to share a quick little anecdote. I was part of an article for the College in Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario, and one of my physicians, that when I had shown up to my appointment a few weeks later, he said, "Hey, I saw that article in that magazine," and he said, and this is a very well-established physician, and he said, "I had never heard of the word ableism before," and he said, "Thank you for teaching me." And in that appointment, I actually noticed him saying, this room really isn't set up properly. I can see the obstacles that you go through. So just by reading that article and him having the humility to say, "I didn't know that word," without me even having to say any more, he noticed all of the obstacles that I was facing now when I go to see him. And I've seen this physician for like years and years and years. We go way back. And so it's not just big, it's also small. And so I would encourage people to think local as well.
Thinking 5 years, 10 years from now, looking back, I think success is going to be us moving away from, again, that transactional and accommodation space into embracing universality. And so having policies where we strive for access and accessibility, focus on ability, and we're not just looking at accommodations. I think that's the goal. I think how we get there is going to start with actually everyone, right? And this is at the pre-medicine level, looking at admissions to medical students, clerks, residents, and staff, actually looking at job descriptions. I would challenge a lot of physicians. Do you actually have a job description? Does it talk about how much you have to lift, how much you have to stand, what the sensory requirements are? Let's go back and actually map our jobs so we know what is an absolute must-do and what is old dogma and, just culture that's persisted. And once we have that list, we can go back and start saying, how do we move towards universality? So I think that is something we can each do regardless of the hats we wear.
The last word.
There's some pressure here now. Each of my colleagues here have really articulated amazing vision for where they would love to see 5 to 10 years. And I'm going to put sort of that leader hat back on and say, well, how can I help? And I think that's what I would love to see, is that we've got leadership that are proactively, not being pushed into this, but proactively sensitized to asking the question, just sort of like your family doctor was mentioning to you, Lynn, that they could actually see, they saw the problems. And so I see ourselves in a space where, can we give individuals new lenses to see the world? And in doing so, thinking about that micro, meso, and macro kind of level things that need to happen, because some things have to happen on that one-on-one basis, but there are some system level things we gotta push, but collectively push in order to make this actually happen. But I'm more excited now more than ever, because there are amazing individuals and an organization like CAPD that is here who wants to push into this space. So we need to come alongside, we need to partner, we need to ally in this space. And so that's my pushback to the EDIA leaders, but also those that are in this room. I see there are patients in this room. Your voices really do matter in this space. Really, really do. The politicians listen to you, right? And so we can each push into this space and make this actually a reality.
It is. I started this panel by saying that it was it's my pleasure to be in Canada. Truly, it's my pleasure to watch all of the work happening. It excites me so much to see it, and it's my pleasure to have spent this time with you today. Thank you so much. If we can get a round of applause for this amazing group. And special thanks to the AFMC for inviting us and allowing this discussion to happen. They've been amazing. Thank you for the honor of being here on behalf of myself and my co-host, Dr. Peter Poulos. We are so appreciative of this opportunity and the opportunity to be in Canada with people doing amazing work. So thank you all so much. Wow, what an incredible experience. Thank you for being such a welcoming group. And we encourage you to listen to our other podcast episode, the panel on technical standards in Canadian academic medicine. We extend our heartfelt gratitude to the Association of Faculties of Medicine of Canada, or AFMC, for inviting us to host 2 live Docs with Disabilities Initiative panels at the International Congress on Academic Medicine. We also wish to thank our wonderful panelists and the incredible audience in Vancouver for their very warm welcome. This podcast is a production of the Docs with Disabilities Initiative and is supported in part by the University of Michigan Medical School, Department of Family Medicine, and Disability Initiative, the Stanford Medicine Alliance for Disability Inclusion and Equity, and the Ford Foundation. The opinions expressed on this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of the hosts, their respective institutions, or our funders. This podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, Non-Derivative license. This episode was produced by me,
Lisa Meeks, and Jacob Feeman.